but want to hear this. So thank you for being here. I know that folks will continue to come in and listen, but please welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Tiffany McCoy. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-executive director of House Our Neighbors here in Seattle. We are recording. We do have closed captioning. I'm going to do a really quick intro and then turn it over to Michael. There will be time for question and answers. I am asking folks to hold all questions until the end. Let's get through the presentation, but please do jot those down. Feel free to put those in the chat, share those with me on a private message, or hold on to them till the end, but definitely want to have time for questions at the end. And I am recording. So just getting started. We have today a good friend and someone that I look up to for a lot of advice and input on urban planning, amongst many other things. Michael Eliason. Michael is the founder of Larch Lab, which is an architecture and urbanism think and do tank that focuses on prefabricated, decarbonized, climate adaptive, low energy urban buildings, sustainable mobility, and livable eco districts. For most of you know, if not, I'll just really briefly remind or inform folks that House Our Neighbors, the organization which I'm the co-ED of, has run 2 successful ballot initiatives in the city of Seattle, one to create a social housing developer and one to fund one. When we were trying to figure out what our building standards should be for the social housing developer, we went to Michael, and Michael is the reason that we mandated passive house design for all new construction for the social housing developer. As most of you know, if you're from the Seattle region, or maybe you're from different areas, but here in Seattle and in lots of parts of Washington, we are actually in the midst of our comprehensive planning process, our land use update. Ours is prolonged. We are quite behind, but we are in that process. And from the outset, House Our Neighbors knew that we needed a social housing developer, but we also knew that we needed to couple that with getting rid of exclusionary zoning in order for social housing to realize its full potential. So we are advocating for more density. We are advocating, if folks still remember, the alternative 6. That's not on the table anymore, but that's what we were advocating for and still hope to see in the future of our land use code in here in Seattle. If you've been paying attention to the process, you'll know that there's a lot of issues that we're pushing back against, but there's also been this big discussion about protecting our tree canopy. Before anyone gets like heckles up, I just want to say I was recently in Glendale to talk about social housing and was very happy to come back to Seattle, where we have an abundant, beautiful tree canopy. Glendale, unfortunately, does not. I was reminded very quickly when I came back how happy I am to live in the Pacific Northwest, and specifically in Seattle. But a lot of the conversation around density and trees has turned into a dichotomy between you can have housing or you can have trees, but you can't necessarily have both. And we're here to kind of shatter that and to hopefully talk across lines, if you will. We think that we need density across the city. We definitely want trees and tree canopy. But what we're not hearing from folks that oppose the type of density that House Our Neighbors would like to see, nor do we see any of the conversation in the mayor's plan or from most of the city council, are the following approaches in addition to our tree canopy. One is, how do we increase public transit use while also incentivizing the reduction of personal vehicle miles traveled? As you'll see from this synopsis from the City of Seattle, the Office of Sustainability and Environment, personal vehicles account for a lot of our metric tons of carbon emissions here in the City of Seattle. You'll see from this slide, the orange on the top is medium and heavy duty. The dark blue is individuals driving, and then the light blue is buses. So how do we use our comp plan to increase transportation that's public and decrease individual miles traveled in your vehicles? Something else that is missing from the comprehensive plan discussion is mandating passive house in new construction. I am sure that Michael will get into this a lot later, and this is also why we've mandated passive house design. You will not find any mention of passive house in our comprehensive plan. Another thing that is missing in the discussion and doesn't seem to be on the table is how we reduce parking spaces to make space for denser construction on land and increasing our tree canopy. What you'll see from this slide is a picture of a way that we could have had more trees, but instead our planning has led us to actually increase parking spaces. So how do we have a grounded discussion where we start talking about maybe if we want to have a robust tree canopy, we also need to be willing to give up some of our parking spaces. We're also not discussing the investing in mass timber, hempcrete, and other sustainable sources for constructing buildings. There's no plan or discussion in any public policy setting to pedestrianize our streets. You'll see on the left-hand side here, this is a town in France. It used to be dedicated to cars, and now it's dedicated to plants and green space and walkability. We're not focused on depaving as a way to meet our climate goals and to increase our tree canopy. And then finally, there is no discussion that is taking place either about mandating that all new areas where there are upzones, that there is a certain percent of that land in new construction that has to only be built by affordable housing developers or social housing developers. These are just a couple of ideas. These are a couple of things that we're seeing missing from the comprehensive plan. And if we're all truly rooted in the goal of becoming climate neutral, climate adaptive, or meeting our climate goals, then we need to be doing a whole lot more than just talking about tree canopy or one of these individual things. So those are a couple of ideas. I'm going to turn it over to Michael now, though.
All right. Are you able to see my slides? Are we good?
Yep.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be talking about some climate adaptation policies. I will start by saying that I'm an architect. I've lived in Seattle for almost 20 years. Was fortunate enough to live in Germany, or maybe it was a misfortune, as I'll get into in a little bit. But during the Pacific Northwest heat dome and wildfire smoke crisis and pandemic, I decided to form Larch Lab to kind of focus on how we can get more of these things, these buildings, these urban environments that I was seeing in Germany and other places to be kind of prioritized here in the US. We focus on a number of different issues and topics. I'm also a board member for the Seattle Social Housing PDA, where I chair the real estate committee. I will note that we have two kids, one teenager, one middle schooler. For the last 5 years, we were car free. The city has not done a lot to make car-free living more amenable to families, and so we actually had to buy a used electric vehicle recently, which has been a point of much consternation in our household discussions. I'll note that climate emissions were definitely still going in the wrong way. They've started to come down in some countries, the U.S. and even China, but overall our emissions are still moving in the wrong direction, and they're not dropping, they're not reducing to the degree that we need to. So we're likely going into overshoot, and that's going to have a lot of really drastic effects, some of which in the Pacific Northwest, we've kind of had a nice little preview of what those could be. Climate change is now, the climate crisis is now. We have a wildfire smoke season in the Pacific Northwest. The heat dome, like I said, was really central to kind of my thinking on how we start to think about how we should be changing the city to adapt to these kinds of events. We haven't had a lot of urban flooding and deluges in the Pacific Northwest, but where I was living in Bayern, they've had several over the last couple of years. I think our entire construction and political machine around cities and urbanism is entirely unprepared for this. We don't have any passive mandates in Seattle or Washington. There are some incentives around that. The state of Massachusetts is actually a little bit more progressive, and they're starting to mandate passive house levels of efficiency for multifamily buildings greater than 12,000 square feet. So they've actually found a way to kind of kickstart a number of really innovative building types and housing types that'll protect residents in the long run. And we don't really have a lot of cooling centers. And cooling centers by themselves aren't necessarily that effective either. But it's just one additional layer of how we're not really thinking about all of these events and how we start to prepare for them. The deluges will already come. In fact, they're already here. This is Sevilla. This is last year. I've walked down some of these streets. I've been to Sevilla, and it was heartbreaking for me to see just the destruction from the inundation that happened in the city. These kinds of events are happening all over the world now. Like I said, we haven't seen too many here in the Pacific Northwest. My guess is we'll start to see them pretty soon. And our buildings, our infrastructure, were designed for a climate that no longer exists, right? So this issue around climate change is really, really important. Our weather is changing, our climate is changing. The way that we design our buildings, the energy codes that we are reacting to or designing to, are based on historic data that's 20 to 40 years old. Well, the Seattle from 20 to 40 years ago, weather-wise, climate-wise, is radically different. When we first moved here, I didn't need a rain jacket. I had a small hat. The rain was really, really fine and misty, and I think a lot of you maybe remember that rain. And now our rain is heavier, it's thicker, it's more like East Coast rain or European rain in that regards to me. Our environment is heating up. So all of these things are starting to kind of interact in really, really funky ways. On top of this, it's not just the climate crisis that we have. We also have a massive social isolation crisis, loneliness, social isolation associated with a number of health risks, cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, premature death, right? So we also should be thinking about ways to make our cities focus on this issue a little bit more. Some cities like Barcelona, Paris have strategies, urban strategies specifically designed to start to mitigate these things that maybe we should probably think about copying. And why are we here? Well, the unaffordable housing crisis is nationwide at this point. It's actually, this is from 2023. It's getting worse. The federal level is going to start kneecapping funds for affordable housing left and right. And so we really are going to be in a dire situation where housing will be unaffordable. Our cities will not be climate adaptive. The social isolation issue will only increase. And so I think we need to radically think about how we can start trying to tackle all of these issues simultaneously. And so this talk is maybe some of the ways that we can start to do that. A little bit of history about Seattle. Seattle's zoning plan, original zoning plan was adopted in 1923. The current zoning ordinance is actually not that much different than what the 1923 plan was, which is really just a snapshot of where existing uses were. So if you have a neighborhood, like I live in Upper Fremont, there were a lot of shops and multifamily housing in this neighborhood. So it was already allowing multifamily housing. And so the city said, okay, in 1923, this area will be multifamily housing for this district, where the street is an arterial and there are commercial industries or businesses. We'll say this is a commercial street. And that timeline of that zoning map, that snapshot, has really been the framework for so much of the planning in our city. Our current comprehensive plan update is not really going to be changing that much. The state has required us to do a couple of things around single-family zoning, allowing 4 and 6 plexes in certain areas, and the comprehensive plan itself will maybe upzone a couple of other places. But the overwhelming majority of multifamily housing is actually limited in Seattle to arterials, to literal highways, to the most toxic and dangerous parts in the street. And so I would say we don't really do a lot of multifamily zoning and building in this city really well. And this foundation is a big part of why. This is the street my kids have to cross to go to school. This is Aurora. I'm sure most of you know this. The city has, zone capacity for like 50,000, 70,000 people on either side of this highway. It's a literal highway dividing, two halves of the city. And there's no real effort, no funding to research these neighborhoods, to rethink this street, to maybe be more climate focused, to be more sustainable and active mobility focused than what it currently is. And when we start to zoom out and look at how are we doing district scale development, transit oriented development around even transit stops, we see a lot of the same thing. This is the Othello station. You've got density really limited to that half block, 1 block off of that arterial, right? Noise pollution, air pollution, and then almost immediately falling away to single family zoning. Well, if you've ever been to Asia, if you've ever been to South America, if you've ever been to Europe, you'll know that no other country, no other city in the world really plans like this, right? This is really an American and Canadian concept. And even the Canadians aren't as strict or severe in kind of their dichotomy, this bifurcation that we see here in the US. We are doing a lot of effort around transit-oriented development, around light rail infrastructure. I would say that the legacy of a lot of Sound Transit is going to be highway-adjacent transit-oriented development that is not of a high quality of life, that is not people-focused, that is not great for kids, it's not great for families, it's not great for public health. And even thinking about how our city is going to adapt to HB 1110 and missing middle, our missing middle right now in Seattle is already incredibly auto-centric. there's not a lot of forethought or effort into trying to make this better, more climate adaptive, more friendly for aging in place, more affordable. The city's trying to do a couple of tweaks around allowing affordable housing or maybe a stacked flat bonus. My guess is a lot of the work around that will, due to the economics of where everything is right now, high interest rates, high insurance rates, high construction costs, a lot of that won't really come to fruition. And when we start to look at even our denser neighborhoods, right, our buildings themselves, they're much thicker than you would find in the European context, right? So we have massive double loaded corridor buildings. Our multifamily housing is designed like a hotel. You have a corridor down the middle and small bowling lane shaped units on either side with maybe one window at the end. It's radical departure from the way we build housing and neighborhoods in other parts of the world. Our buildings are significantly thicker, and so that means that their courtyards in these buildings are also significantly smaller. This means there's less space for nature, there's less space for community, and of course, there's less space for trees. But like I said, I was either fortunate or misfortunate to have worked in Freiburg and in Germany and a couple of other places throughout my career. Freiburg is kind of like this candy land, this wonderland of climate adaptive, people friendly urbanism that really has no frame of reference for anything in the US. The bike mode share of this city is something like 30%, another 20 to 30% walk or take the transit. They're very effective at building these wonderful kind of people scaled car light districts in the city. And the entire core of the city, the historic core, is a pedestrian zone. It's got these wonderful streets, these narrow streets. They've pulled all of the cars out. Taxis are allowed to come in. If you have residents who need a car for mobility issues, right, they can still bring a car to their place. But really, the entire city, the core of the city, is designed around this concept of like deprioritizing the car, providing space for people, providing space for nature, and it's a quite wonderful, lush environment. And it's also the quietest place I've ever lived. This is the canal that runs through the middle of the city. The apartment I lived in was a block from here. I never heard cars in the city. I would just hear the tram, the ding ding as it would start rolling at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and then just people going about their daily lives. And children, the number of children I would hear in the city is wildly different than any other place I've ever lived or even visited. And even outside of the core of the city, there's a strong focus on providing or prioritizing active mobility. This is actually a former car street that they've converted into a streetcar and then a biking and walking lane. And it's incredibly wonderful. I've biked, walked, taken the tram down this road, midnight, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 7 o'clock in the morning. And it's just a really wonderful way to kind of come from one of the outer neighborhoods of the city into the core of the city. And so I have this frame of reference that is really kind of unusual, weird, that has kind of affected my thinking and about how we think about cities, how we can adapt to climate change. And so I'm going to posit that I think these are 10 strategies that we need to be rapidly adopting, not just to make a city that is more adaptive to all of the threats that climate change is going to throw at us, but also to make a much more livable and humane city as well. Tiffany already mentioned this, that cars are our number one source of pollution in the city. It's carbon emissions. That's also just pollution associated with automobiles. On top of this, cars are getting larger and larger. They're getting heavier. Even if there weren't the same number of cars in this, even if the number of cars in the city hadn't grown, there are 60% more cars in the city of Seattle today than there were 30 years ago. As a frame of reference, Paris has actually seen a reduction in car ownership by 45% in that same time period. But the size of cars today, largely SUVs, are significantly larger than the typical car was 30 years ago. So even if we hadn't seen more cars in the city, congestion would actually be worse. But because there are more cars in the city, more cars in the region, and also these cars are getting larger and larger, despite what the mayor claims would happen when he was running for election last time, congestion and road safety are not getting better. The total vehicle miles traveled is also increasing. We're going the wrong way. We actually have a plan that we're supposed to be somewhat meeting to reduce the number of vehicle miles traveled, but we're going in the wrong direction. Post-COVID, this number is going back up again as well. So again, we have all of these climate goals. We're not really good. We're not really effective at meeting them. This issue around cars is actually exacerbated by parking mandates. I call it the carbon iceberg of parking. So when you have a building and you provide parking underneath, about 40 to 50% of the carbon emissions, total carbon emissions in the construction, the erection of this building are actually derived or coming from the parking itself. So we only see the building on top, but almost half of the carbon emissions of the building, and in smaller buildings, it can be even higher, are actually coming from the parking below. So there are these underlying aspects, these things that we don't necessarily see that also influence kind of our carbon emissions in the city. The study for that previous project had 77 parking stalls underground. If we look at the embodied carbon of the cars that are going to go into that over a 50-year cycle, assuming a 10-year life cycle for those cars, right? The amount of carbon associated with just the manufacturing of the cars that go in this place, in this parking garage, is massive. And so we don't just have the direct emissions associated with parking cars, but there are also all of these indirect emissions. And then there are other aspects too: air pollution, tire pollution that's affecting salmon runoff, and all of these other issues. And as some of you saw yesterday, right, our infrastructure was designed for a climate that no longer exists. This was in, I think it was Oklahoma. It was so hot that the road actually buckled, launching a car into the air that hit this buckle immediately after. These kinds of events are going to become more and more common with the extreme heat that we're seeing. And so we're going to need to find ways to move around the city that don't necessarily prioritize this mode of transportation, because if this starts popping off in more parts of the city, there's going to be huge costs associated with it. There's going to be times when cars can't access massive parts of the city. And so we really need to be thinking about how do we get people around the city without making this issue even worse. And the mayor loves to talk about electric vehicles. Like I said, congestion has gotten worse. Electric vehicles are not going to solve that issue. We need to be thinking about decarifying our city. Shared mobility is great. So we actually, the way that we were able to survive without a car in the city is we had programs like Gig, which were moderately affordable. We could ride our bike. We had a folding bike to go pick it up and then come back and get the kids, and use it to do trips locally, regionally. When Gig disappeared, we lost kind of our lifeline to not owning a car, and so we actually had to break down and deal with it. But when I was living in Bavaria, the issues around shared mobility were really, really critical to making it so that people could get around, right? Could still get to places, could still do trips with a car that was not expensive to use, and they didn't have to pay for, like, cars are parked 99% of the time, right? So you're not having to pay, for the 98.99999% that you're not using that car. A really common strategy that they started to roll out in cities like Munich and other places was this concept of this kind of shared electrified mobility hub. So they have cargo bikes that you could rent to, go grab groceries or go run errands where you need a cargo bike. They have small electric cars that you could rent by the minute or the hour. It was also structured as a cooperative, right? And so it's owned by the members who are using it. It was incredibly affordable. The city of Seattle actually has a pilot program for this as well, but there are only a handful of spots in the city to do this. It's also a lot more expensive than it was in Bavaria. Excuse me. And it's really difficult to get to these locations. But I think this is a really, really powerful way of making it so that people can maybe shift from having two-car household to a one-car household, or maybe if they're a one-car household, to drop that car and start to do other things. The next strategy I think is really important is that the city needs to lean into our single stair development, the Seattle Special. And with a few tweaks in how we lay out our buildings, our zoning, we could actually get not just more housing, better housing. We could also get significant increase in the number of trees. The way we develop housing in the US is a complete anomaly compared to the rest of the world for a number of reasons: building code, zoning code, financing. It induces these larger and larger buildings. Planners will play these games to try to make it look not so big, right? We'll modulate the facade, or we'll mandate a bunch of different materials, but it's still a big unit. It's a building. It's really difficult to make it not look like a big building. And so we have these huge block size developments that are going up all over the city. They're deeper than you would find in other places. It's really difficult to get the economics of family-sized units in these buildings as well. So they're primarily studios and one-bedroom units. So there's not like a really good diversity of household types in that. There's not a lot of economic and social diversity in these buildings as well. And so going to the single stair, the Seattle Special, kind of gives us a way to start to think about how we can create these cities that are more like Asia, more like Tokyo, more like Berlin. There are primarily three different ways that we access housing. This is a small departure, but I think this is really important to talk about, like, how we access our homes in a building. The primary mode in the US is the double loaded corridor. Like I said, this is living in a hotel. Corridor down the middle, that's the yellow, and then really small units on either side. This is really common for a number of reasons. The big one is that our building codes mandate two stairs, two means of vertical egress from the unit in case of fire. We do sprinkler buildings, whether they're single stair, multi-stair in the US, and sprinklers have really kind of basically eradicated most multifamily issues related to fires in the US. Single loaded corridor is much more common, but it's you have a corridor on the edge of the building. It can be internal, it can be external, and then your units off of one side. This is a little bit better. You've got a thinner building, so there's more space for nature. You've got units that can have daylight on both sides. You've got units that can cross ventilate. You can't get that in the double loaded corridor, but this isn't as efficient. And so because our zoning codes allow just a ridiculous amount of FAR compared to other countries, and developers naturally want to optimize the amount of FAR that they can build, we don't really see this in the US. But this is a really common typology in a lot of European non-market housing like cooperatives and social housing. But the primary mode of housing the world over, outside of the US and Canada, is the single stair building. The idea is you have one stair, elevator core, and a handful of units around it. These are generally much thinner buildings. In Germany, less than 40 feet. In Seattle, our double loaded corridor buildings are approaching 80 to 100 feet. So like I said, they're radically deeper buildings than we find in other countries. The limitation on the number of units per stair in a roundabout way kind of induces larger buildings. And so in Switzerland, you'll see single stair buildings with one, two, three, even four and five bedroom units around the single stair condition. I've never seen a 5-story multifamily apartment in the US, and I've been looking for a really long time. These are units that can cross ventilate, they get daylight on multiple sides, but also importantly, because they're thinner, right, there's more space for green, there's more space for nature. Seattle in the US is kind of this anomaly where we've allowed single stair conditions for 50 years. We allow it up to 6 stories. We allow up to 2 conditions per floor. So you can take something, maybe it's a 3-bedroom and a 2-bedroom, or a couple of, a 1, a 2, and a 3-bedroom around one stair core. You can actually mirror it. And so you can still get moderately sized buildings on a typical Seattle lot, right? So you've got anywhere from 4 or 6 units, if it's just like one stair with, 1 unit per floor, all the way up to 50 units, right? And so we get still the ability to get large development in these kinds of things. The ability to cross ventilate, to get light on multiple sides is really, really important, especially in a warming world. And then another one where, especially in a city like Seattle, where we focus so much density on these loud and toxic streets, we could actually position the bedrooms on the quiet side of the building, right? So at least when people are sleeping, it's much quieter and more habitable. This issue around the thinness of buildings really, really fascinates me. It's kind of the Higgs boson of housing. These thinner buildings, not only do they take less floor area than the typical double loaded corridor to house the same number of people, there's a reduction in floor area to do that. So there's cost savings potentially with that. There's a reduction in embodied carbon associated with that as well. And so there are all of these kind of knock-on effects, right? And that's a really important issue in a lot of these strategies, is that there are a number of synergies and co-benefits to these approaches that can all kind of start to work together in a really fascinating way. This is a satellite view of a typical kind of missing middle block in Seattle. This is in Ballard, right? There's a diversity of housing here. There's 4 detached houses. There's a couple of duplexes. There's small apartments and row houses. What you'll notice though is that because of our zoning, there's not a lot of trees. In fact, there are fewer trees now than there were previously. And as some neighborhoods redevelop, I think, going towards something like this, where these aren't accessible units, these aren't affordable units, you can't age in place. There's not space for nature. There's not space for kids, right? That's not really how we should be thinking about how to plan our cities. With a small tweak, allowing 3 and 4-story buildings that touch, setting them to the front of the street, all of a sudden, similar block scale, we've got way more space for trees, way more space for nature. Well, if we start to plant more trees on the street too, we can get trees on both sides of a building. And so what you get is a situation where it's similar to living in a detached house, where you have trees and daylight on multiple sides of the building that our current paradigm around building multifamily housing doesn't really allow. And even in the denser neighborhoods, right, you see that same effect. Big buildings that take up most of the lot, really tiny courtyards. It's difficult to get trees to live in these places. In the European context, right, there's more space for trees. There's more space for nature. This could be individual And this is individual kind of yards, rear yards in the back of this perimeter block. But it could be like this is really common in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, and Denmark, right? It could be this kind of collective, commonly owned outdoor space as well. The third strategy is I think we need to be thinking about a low carbon building infrastructure, an ecosystem around building decarbonized buildings. Mass timber has seen a lot of work here in the US. I was working on mass timber buildings in Freiburg in 2003, 2004. And so we were a decade or longer behind Europe on mass timber, and they're doing things with mass timber today that actually are even wilder than anything that I've seen here in the US. We have this opportunity, especially with the social housing PDA and some other organizations, to start to develop this ecosystem with building up the trades to learn how to do this, but not just around mass timber. There's also some wonderful opportunities around prefabricated, passive house certified straw panels. This is a company based out of Slovakia, EcoCocon. They are working on projects in the US. They're doing 12-story multifamily buildings in Sweden. The idea is you take these really light boxes. It's this really elegant system. It's passive house certified. It's prefabricated. It's made in a climate controlled factory. They bring it out and they can put these up on a site. And the wonderful thing about straw is like this byproduct of agriculture. It's just sitting there. If we don't harvest it, it turns into methane, which causes climate issues down the road and immediately. If we can harvest that and turn it into a building envelope element that not only sequesters that carbon, but makes it so that the carbon that we use to operate our building, so in the heating and the cooling, is minimized, right? There's those co-benefits, those additional benefits. The EU is all in on these issues around circularity, on prefabrication. I worked on a rammed earth house when I was in college in 2002. Yeah, 2002. There's this company in Austria that's making prefabricated, robotically tamped. So they have a machine, a robot that comes in and tamps this. You don't have to do it. The physical labor, which is really, really intense and adds a lot of cost. Rammed earth assembly, rammed earth walls. And they go out, they cut this up into the sizes that are needed, take it to the site, and install it. And it's just this really elegant way to get this low carbon, cement-free building element placed in the system. I really think that the way we're doing transit-oriented development in the US is kind of a farce. A lot of the focus in China and Japan and Europe is on eco districts. And so I won't get into what the definition of an eco district is because it varies a little bit. But to me, it's an ecologically oriented district. There is transit. There's a tram line that rolls through this district in Vienna. This is Sonnenviertel. There's a ton of housing. There's space for jobs. The whole back area here is pedestrianized. There's a school campus, right? So when the city was planning this, they planned for a space for schools, right? Because we have families moving into this district. Well, they need a place to send their schools. So there's an educational campus. There are daycares interspersed throughout this entire district. Families can actually go from their house to daycare to transit without interacting with a single car, right? It's like mind blowing in terms of like how different the quality of life is. The issues around parks, I think park oriented development, we have this huge open space and green space deficiency in dense areas, and that's not going to improve with the Washington State Transit Oriented Development Bill. So we have this opportunity to rethink districts to be oriented around parks and climate adaptation in a really impressive way. Much of our TOD is adjacent to highways. I would argue that parks are much better places to be living next to rather than a highway. This is the Clichy-Batignolles Eco District, Eco Quartier in Paris. In other countries, they allow dense multifamily housing off of arterials. Talk about co-benefits. It's quieter, it's safer, it induces better walkability as well. A big part of this is that the interior of transit-oriented development does not deprioritize automobility. You go to almost any other country in the world, the interior of an eco district is quiet, it's traffic calmed, it prioritizes movement with bikes, foot, wheeling, and transit over the car. You could have an entire pedestrianized network within the district to get around without interacting with cars. Where there is infrastructure, we have the opportunity to make it perform double duty. This is the light rail line that goes to another district that's underway in Vienna, Seestadt. The entire area underneath it has become this place for kids to play, right? So infrastructure isn't just necessarily a way for people to get around, but it could also provide shaded places for kids to play and also induce aspects around climate mitigation. This is playground in Munich's Domag Park. The entire playground is sunken. When there are deluges, the water comes here, and so it doesn't flood the houses, and it provides another layer of mitigation for residents. When we think about planning cities and suburbs, we don't really think about planning in a more holistic way. This is Rieselfeld in Freiburg. This is a really wonderful eco district that was under development when I was living there. These are all really thin buildings. They're all pulled to the edge of the street, creating a really wonderful street wall. And then these interiors, they're lush, they're green, there's space for community, there's space for kids, there's space for trees. But another really important aspect of this, it's not focused on the intersection of two main roads. It's this road over here is a highway. This is an arterial. It's separated from these roads. They also sculpt the earth, so there's some topography to shield the district from the noise pollution of these roads, which see a lot of use. And so the interiority, the quality of life living in this district is radically different than it is living in transit-oriented development in the US. All of this green on this map are areas where the noise levels at night are 45 decibels or lower. So it's actually quieter than the single family neighborhoods that dot most of Seattle. But these are 4 to 6 story buildings, as in the picture behind me. When I think about transit-oriented development in Seattle, there aren't a lot of things that you would find in an eco district that make it have such a high quality of life. This is the Roosevelt station in Seattle. There's not a lot of space for trees. There are not parks in the middle of the district. There's not a lot of affordable housing. In fact, I would say that maybe we're really good at getting a token affordable housing project or two in the U.S. In Europe, you see districts, eco quartiers that have 25 to 40, even 60% of the units are set aside for working and middle class residents. There's no co-housing. There are no cooperatives that I know of around Roosevelt. There are no car-free streets. There's very little open space. The public realm here is incredibly poor. It's not the kind of place that I would want to live in, compared to some of the things that I know living in other places. Another thing that we'll have to adapt to, and as all of our friends on the East Coast have been warming up to for, please excuse the pun, is this issue related to heat. Solar protection is an industry that does not exist in the US. It exists in other countries, but preventing the sun from getting into your building can reduce your cooling loads by 70 to 80%. In passive house buildings, it can be even smaller. We need to be thinking about how to reduce the amount of heat that's entering our buildings. There's this huge equity issue in Seattle related to access to cooling. Even new apartments in 4 or 6 story mid-rise buildings don't have air conditioning. Our energy codes can only do so much. I have friends who live in a top floor of a 7 story building downtown. It faces southwest. It was built within the last 5 years, so it's built to the current energy code. In summer, when it's 80 degrees, 85 degrees outside, their place bakes. There's no way to get it to be more habitable because there's no way to block the sun from entering. So I think that we need to be having a larger conversation about how we reduce solar access on buildings in the shoulder seasons even, and in summer. The city of Vienna offers a €1,500 subsidy for residents who want to put external solar protection on their buildings, and it's something that's even available for renters. So not only do they have an entire industry around solar protection, and that's important in Vienna because there aren't a lot of buildings that have cooling, but they're finding ways to kind of expand the survivability of residents in those heat events by focusing on this, and then expanding it to renters, not just something that homeowners can access. This issue around passive house protection is pretty paramount. When Tiffany approached me about what kind of building standard the social housing PDA should be, in my mind, passive house was really the only one that made the most sense. There are a number of co-benefits to living in a passive house. One, you've got fresh filtered air. You've got a building where you don't have cold drafts. Asthma and things of those nature are lower in passive house buildings. The biggest one to me, and this was right after a smoke event, was that the smoke protection, we call it smoke tight in the passive house community of these buildings, is far, far superior to any other building standard that you would find in the US. This is an air filter on the ventilation system for a passive house affordable housing project, just one block off of MLK. This isn't even during smoke season. This is just regular pollution coming off of MLK from the cars and from the street, from the light rail. And this is only after 20 days, right? And so if they didn't have this filter protecting the residents, these residents would have to breathe this air. And so passive house is kind of this way of building this housing that is going to protect residents in a very long way. Through a number of reasons, it also induces buildings that use a lot less energy, right? And so we're reducing energy poverty, we're reducing the operational carbon. We can make it easier to electrify our buildings. And then a big one too is just reducing the mold risk in our buildings. With climate change, we're going to see a lot more moisture in the air, a lot more rain. So our buildings, our buildings that are existing are going to see a lot of issues related to mold kind of increase. If I was looking for a job in the next 10 years, mold mediation would probably be a really good one to go into. And so passive house, because of the way that we're building these buildings, right, the risk for issues like this goes down dramatically. And so it just becomes a much better way of living in a building. I think that we need to be depaving our streets, and we need to be depaving our streets at a much greater clip than any city in the US is doing it. Number of reasons. One, mitigating the urban heat island effect. Two, mitigating stormwater issues and rain deluges, which we're going to see more and more of. But there are also other co-benefits, right? This used to be a car street where the trees was car parking, right? Like this is a much more elegant and friendly way of living in a city. You see your residents, you know your residents. We can start to think about this in a larger scale too. This is the Bentham Water Square in Rotterdam. They rehabilitated this square in a part of the city to incorporate play areas. There's a stage, there's a basketball and a soccer court, places where kids can hang out. That also can collate all of the stormwater inundation when it comes in, right? And so this is what it looks like after a major rain event. And so, it's holding all of this water, and then the water will slowly dissipate into the earth. And so it's kind of mitigating some of the issues around flooding that we need to be thinking about. Really, really, really think we need to be thinking about bike-friendly, wheelchair-friendly, rolling-friendly urbanism at a much greater scale. Our mode split for bicycles in Seattle is 3%. Like I said, it's 30% in Freiburg, and they're actually trying to increase it even more, right? So they want to go, so much further than that, and we can't even touch, we're barely touching the bottom. We're barely doing the minimum. Making it possible so that people can get around in wheelchairs and bicycles opens up so much more of the city. E-bikes also can play a massive role in this. When we lived in Bavaria, there was a big hill in our city. A lot of elderly residents lived on the hill. They could hop on their e-bikes and come into the city and participate and shop, people watch, go to the market, do all of those things they needed to do without driving, saving them money, keeping them active as well. And so I think it's really important, especially when we think about how detrimental cars are to society and livability and social isolation, that we kind of, reorient our cities around this thing. Scooters are a big one. A number of schools in Germany have scooter dedicated parking, right? If I think about kids in the elderly residents on bikes, e-bikes, scooters as kind of like this indicator species of a livable city, we're not there yet, but I think that both of my kids have had scooters for years. There's a lot of interest in creating places that are much safer for kids to get around. Of course, retrofitting existing parking lots to prioritize. Bicycles is a big issue. This issue around electric vehicles fascinates me. So Rivian's own life cycle assessment study of their car found that it requires 66 tons to manufacture, operate, and dispose of one of their cars. Well, that's equivalent to 220 e-bikes. And so when we start to think about, scalability and embodied carbon and mobility and all of these things together, right? The image on the left, the e-bike, is multiple times better for the climate than even, your typical electric SUV is. It's about prioritizing streets for people, not streets for cars. Bicycle garages instead of car garages. Hopefully they're adjacent to transit. Better mobility. Collective housing is another really important aspect. The IPCC has noted that Social housing, co-housing, cooperatives allow people to get by in a smaller space. They're connected to their neighbors. They use less space, so their carbon footprints are lower. When there are issues, because they know their residents, they're better as well. Adaptability of units is important to this as well. Thinking about different ways of living together, I think, is another component of this. And then the last one, rapid scale prototyping. How do we start to rapidly roll out these things? It took what, years for the city to even think about pedestrianizing Pike Place Market. We have a half block of pedestrianized space in front of it on Pike that took forever to do. During the pandemic, cities like Berlin, Paris, were rolling out these really, really rapid prototypes of prioritizing active and sustainable mobility, and they're paying dividends today. This is Paris. This is a really wonderful transformation, prioritizing bikes, prioritizing buses, prioritizing people in wheelchairs. And so all of these co-benefits, right? There's safer streets. It's better to mitigate against inflation. It increases local spending. It makes happier citizens. We get to meet our climate goals. We have cleaner air, more space for nature, more space for trees, quieter city, massive public health wins. There are so many reasons that we should be doing all of these things, and we're not. And my hope is that the city, with the comp plan, with the transportation plan, which aren't integrated but should be, there may be opportunities to tweak those things. And so that's all I have. Tiffany, how are we on time?
We are good, Michael. I do have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to jump into those now, if you are up for it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I always learn more from you and also become very inspired by what we could do if we work together to achieve this type of city here in Seattle. I know that there is a lot of political will. It's just about us coming together to fight for it with our elected leaders. So first is a question on what would your top three recommended books be on the topics that you discussed today? He can include his own book, which you've already done here. So what are maybe two or three other books on the topics or that inspired you to get to where you are that you can share with the group?
So my book, Building for People, which was published last December, really goes into detail, a lot more detail on a lot of these topics, and then additional topics as well. It's really funny. I don't actually the space of climate adaptation is so forward looking and recent that there aren't a lot of books that really focus on it. Most of my inspiration has come from reports, mobility reports that cities like Paris and Delft are doing, reports that the city of New York City and Rotterdam have been doing around stormwater mitigation and dealing with the flood risks associated with rising seas and that nature as well. I think so much of this is like we're at the forefront of all of these issues, right? Like 10 years ago, we didn't have whole neighborhoods burning down in cities, urban places in most countries. And in the last, 2 or 3 years, I can think of, offhand, 3 or 4 cities in the US and Canada that have had entire neighborhoods just completely destroyed. And so I think a lot of it is just we're still at like the forefront of so much of this. There probably are a number of books that are in the works, but none of those are coming to my mind, unfortunately.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. All right. I have a couple of longer questions, so do feel free, Michael, to look at the chat if that's easier. But the first one that I have is from David. Germany is great mandating zero impact to new construction or not getting a permit. Seattle no longer has single-family zoning. It will take a while to be built out, but indeed, Seattle no longer has single-family zones since 2020 with at least 3 homes per lot, doubling to 6 in July 2025 within a quarter mile of major transit. What does Michael feel about not only mandating affordability, but also setting a minimum number of units within neighborhood residential zones? If areas are allocated within private property for parking, what does Michael feel about mandating 20% of middle housing development for tree retention and planting, like Portland, Oregon Title 11, Table 50.1 does?
There's a lot of questions. Um, let's see. Let's start with the mandating affordability. So mandating affordability is an interesting topic with buildings that are 4 to 6 units. Mandating affordability is basically a tool to ensure that no housing will pencil. So as it currently is, and the city's report on stacked flats showed that almost no stacked flats will pencil under the current proposal from the mayor's office. Really, the only thing we're going to see are townhomes, and so you might be able with subsidy get a couple of developments that are able to do this, or maybe like a Habitat for Humanity type project. But if we're looking at broad scale housing implementation, mandating even 1 out of 6 units being affordable is the economics of it are so horrendous, especially with where insurance rates are, especially with where land costs and construction costs are. And then you toss in the interest rates, which are really, really high as well, that I don't see it working out. And this is an issue that we've been looking at at the social housing PDA is these smaller buildings are not going to be how we get affordable housing. We need to be looking at, 20 plus unit buildings to really start to get the scale necessary to get affordable housing to pencil. And so it's this mixed thing where I come from, where I was working in Germany. They'll mandate affordable housing in districts, so at a much larger scale, they'll be able to get affordability, but they'll do it in ways where they're mandating that requirement, but then they set aside the land for affordable housing developers. They provide access to funding and financing for affordable housing developers. They're not relying on private developers to basically make that. There are some places where that happens, but those are places that tend not to build very many homes. What were some of the other questions?
If areas are allocated within private property for parking, what does Michael feel about mandating 20% of middle housing development for tree retention and planting, like Portland, Oregon, Title 11, Table 50.1?
So I guess the question is if there's parking off-site for the development about mandating trees. I think that can work, but I think again you need to go back to looking at where the housing is on the development. And so with what we're currently looking at, where we have setbacks on the front and the sides, it really pushes that development into the middle. It's difficult to get a 20% contiguous area. Whereas like if you look at that example, from Germany, where the buildings are set to the front of the lot, they're touching on the sides, where you have 60% of the lot is already open space. Okay, if we put parking on the backside on an alley, and that's 15 20%, you still have 40% of the lot as open space where trees can go. It's really more an issue around how we think about setbacks and how we want the city to grow, and that's a discussion that no one at the city wants to have. But I think that's the actual issue. And so if we keep mandating setbacks, then we're not going to get anything that we really want.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next from Sandy. Love these scenarios for LR mixed zones. Can you also suggest ways for Seattle's current neighborhood residential zones to improve in all these ways when there are just 4 to 6 units per lot? Since it's where the majority of the city's urban forest is, we would love to push for ways to share walls, be more efficient, and leave space for trees. I'm with Tree Action Seattle. Thank you for this amazing view of where we can go.
So Sandy's reached out actually, and I worked on a slideshow. I don't know if you know where it is, Tiffany. I can try to find it and throw it into the chat. Kind of talking a little bit about this. This is kind of parallels the discussion around David's question as well, that where buildings go and how we form them has the greatest effect on how much urban tree canopy we can get. And so if we keep fitter buildings, taller buildings, and I would say it doesn't matter if it's, in neighborhood residential or even like low-rise, mid-rise buildings, right? If we put those buildings closer to the front, if we make them thin using single stair or things related to that, we have them, kind of reach out the full breadth of the width of the site. We can open up so much more of the site itself for trees, for preserving those trees in the backyards. In my neighborhood here in Fremont, Upper Fremont, there are almost no trees in front yards. There are definitely no significant trees. There are almost no trees in the side yard setbacks as well. And so we're mandating these to, quote, preserve green space and open space, but it's really not. And then as we redevelop these areas, we're allowing larger buildings. They'll push deeper into the lot, and that's really what kills the ability to have more trees and more open space. Really, the way to think about adding more tree canopy is to, again, push that building to the front, provide adequate space in the back, and then also use that streetscape, right? As you and I both talked about, depaving, using the public right of way to provide space for trees. Again, not just reducing the urban heat island effect, but also making the air cleaner, reducing stormwater runoff, and all of those other wonderful things that trees are great for.
Thanks, Michael. And Shirley did put that link of what you were talking about in the chat, so folks can grab that and save that and take a look at that. I know I have another question from David, but just for the sake of other people having a chance to ask, I'm going to circle back to that. So, next question is from Nate. Do you think the perimeter block is the best typology for Seattle? How would Seattle blocks need to change to do this?
Oh man, I would say the perimeter block is just the greatest urban form in the history of mankind. There are a couple of things that would need to change. We would need to reduce the front and side yard setbacks. The Netherlands, the Dutch do really wonderful things with like a 2 to 3 foot setback. You can get a ton of green space, a stoop, right? You're still able to provide a little bit of a buffer. A lot of our streets also have, like where I live in Fremont, we have fairly wide right away between the lot line and the street itself, right? And so mandating a 3 foot setback there, or allowing just a 3 foot setback there instead of 20 feet, it allows more space for trees, for nature on the back side of the building. There's plenty of space on the front side as well. You, this question around urban morphology is really, really important too. How we want to live in the future is a common refrain found in planning discussions in Germany and Switzerland, and it's almost non-existent here in the US. And I think part of it is we don't do comprehensive planning. We have a comprehensive plan, but as everyone knows, it's not really comprehensive. And so we just kind of have this lot by lot zoning process that is not really workable. It doesn't result in great outcomes. I don't Form-based codes might be a better approach to doing that, but then again, it would need to be really, really light touch. Some form-based codes mandate window fenestration, orientation, and really moronic things like that. As an architect, I don't want to be told how to orient my windows. And so there are some ways to do it, but there would have to be such a massive groundswell from people who actually want Seattle to be a greener and better place.
Okay, Michael, two more questions, and I realize that some folks might need to drop because we might go a few minutes over. Again, we're recording this. We will get it uploaded to the House Our Neighbors YouTube channel this afternoon. Next question is from Anne. How do other countries get a big enough plot? Do they destroy single-family houses?
Uh, it depends. So in new districts that are in industrial areas, they're destroying industrial buildings, or maybe they'll preserve some of the industrial buildings and build around them. But the redevelopment of single-family houses is something that's found the world over. They do it in Tokyo. The history of Berlin and Vienna is, basically palatial houses on large lots getting redeveloped into 4 to 6 story rental buildings that form the core of the most urban districts that I've ever been to. It's not something that's unique. It's not something that's new. There are better ways to do it. Maybe you dismantle the house or have it moved and rebuilt somewhere else. But this issue of like not building in Seattle single family zones, I think is really has caused a lot of issues in our region. It's exacerbated sprawl. We see aerials of neighborhoods outside of the city of Seattle, basically that shouldn't even be in the urban growth boundary, where they're building sprawl for hundreds and hundreds of units that have decimated more trees than Seattle's tree canopy has seen lost in over a decade. And so, there are these kind of knock-on effects. Seattle is not an island. The things that happen here or don't happen here have effects outside of the region. And the more housing we get in Seattle, the better all of these other issues become.
Thanks, Michael. Last question from David. What is 500,000 person Burnaby, British Columbia, next to Vancouver, doing right compared to Seattle with similar urban fabric? They do not seem to be shy about 30 to 50-story residential buildings within open space, especially around major transit stops. And then there was a picture that was sent.
So I don't think that that's a really effective way of redeveloping. You can actually get, I have a friend who's working on his master's thesis for the University of British Columbia on this, that these large lot redevelopments with these towers, you can actually get the same number of units in like 6 to 8 story mid-rise buildings. You get the same or if not more open space. You have better units. You have better access to daylight. You have people that are connected to the ground rather than in this carbon intensive building way up in the air. When we think about climate adaptation, these towers are not going to be great places to be if the power goes out for an extended period of time, which we've seen with wildfires and flooding taking stuff out. During heat events, those upper units facing south and west with no solar protection, they'll bake, and they baked during the heat dome. Um, it was primarily elderly residents and people who didn't have that connection, right? Going back to social isolation, in small buildings, studio one-bedroom units that these larger buildings are made of, that compose the majority of the people who unfortunately succumbed to that heat event. And I think that there's a place for sky rises and or high rises and skyscrapers, but I think when we think about like resilience and adaptation and building humane, people-centered places, the most of the world looks like this: 4 to 6 story buildings in walkable neighborhoods where you don't need a car to do 99% of your trips. And I think that Seattle is well within the has well within the capacity to rethink about developing to prioritize that.
All right, thanks, Michael. Appreciate that. I'm going to wrap us up here. Lots of thanks to you in the chat. Grab Michael's book. I will upload this to YouTube. Get involved in the comprehensive plan. Get involved with House Our Neighbors. Help us to fight for a city that Michael has shown us that we can have. It will take a lot of work, but we can do it. And we need to do it for the future of our species, just to leave it light. So have a good rest of your day. Thanks for being here. Thanks a ton, Michael, for sharing your wisdom. And we'll see you all later, and stay tuned with our next Lunch and Learns. Bye all.
Thanks for having me.